All right, so here we are in chapter 3. This one is all about biopsychology, basically how our biology and our psychology connect, looking at how the body and the brain shape the way that we think, feel, and behave. So, why does this matter? Every memory you have, every time you've ever felt nervous before a test, every habit you've picked up, it's not just all in your head. It's running on real systems in your body, nerve cells firing, hormones being released, genes you inherited from your parents, all working together to make you you. In this chapter, we're going to spend time on three big areas. We're going to look at genetics, so the stuff that you're born with and how it influences both your body and behavior. We're going to look at the nervous system, the brain and network of nerves that controls everything from breathing to problem solving, and endocrine system, which is hormones like adrenaline and cortisol or melatonin that help you regulate stress, sleep, growth, and your mood. When you put all of that together, you start to see how deeply biology is woven into psychology. For example, if someone is struggling with depression, we don't just look at their thoughts. We also consider brain chemistry, hormone levels, and whether there might be a genetic link. Biopsychology is such a fascinating piece of psychology because it helps us see behavior as a part of the whole body and not something separate from it. So let's dive into human genetics. Studying genetics helps researchers understand the biological basis of why people think, feel, and behave the way that they do. In other words, it gives us a way to look at how the code written into our DNA shapes our psychology. Here are some of the kinds of questions genetics can help us answer. Why do two people infected with the same disease have completely different outcomes? Or are there genetic components to psychological disorders like depression or schizophrenia? And how are genetic diseases passed down through family lines? These aren't just biological questions, they connect directly to behavior and mental health. For example, if someone may inherit a higher risk for developing anxiety, but whether or not that anxiety shows up in their life may also depend on their environment. Things like stress, support systems, or even trauma. This is where twin studies come in. Identical twins share 100% of their genes and genetic material, while fraternal twins share about half. By comparing them, researchers can estimate how much of a trait comes from genetics and how much comes from the environment. If identical twins are more alike on certain traits than fraternal twins, that points towards a stronger genetic influence. Can you think of something that runs in your family? Maybe a physical trait like curly hair, or something more behavioral like a tendency towards anxiety. Do you think that genetics or environment, or a mix of both, are contributing factors? So when we study genetics, we're really asking how biology and environment works together to make each person unique. So, moving into the theory of evolution, this goes back to Charles Darwin, who in 1859 published On the Origin of Species. His big idea was natural selection. The traits that help an organism survive and reproduce are more likely to get passed down, while traits that don't tend to help tend to fade away over time. Darwin's theory helps us understand not just physical traits, but behaviors as well. Survival isn't only about claws or camouflage, it's also about behavior. It's traits that protect us from predators, it's traits that help us find food better, it's traits that help increase the chances of keeping our offspring alive. Darwin himself put it like this: it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. So here's where this gets really interesting in psychology. Some psychological traits, like fear responses, may have evolved over time because they help our ancestors survive. People who had a healthy fear of snakes or heights probably lived longer than those who didn't, and they passed those cautious genes on. Let's look at an example of evolution in action: sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic condition where red blood cells form a crescent or a sickle shape instead of the normal round shape. These sickled cells don't move through blood vessels easily and they can cause blockages, pain, and serious health problems. Many people with the disease don't live long lives, so it might seem like natural selection would have eliminated this gene over time. But in certain regions, especially parts of Africa where malaria is common, the story looks very different. People who carry just one copy of the sickle cell gene, not two, are less likely to die from malaria. That protection made it more likely for them to survive and pass the gene on to the next generation. This is why sickle cell is still relatively common in those populations. It's a great example of how a gene that is harmful in one way can also provide an advantage in another, depending on the environment. When we talk about evolution, it's not just about whether a trait is good or bad. It's about how well that trait fits with the environment. Genetic variation just simply means the difference in DNA from one person to another. Those differences are important because they give species the flexibility to adapt to new environments. Genetic variation starts at conception with an egg with 23 chromosomes is fertilized by a sperm with another 23 chromosomes, and together that makes 46 chromosomes that hold all of your genetic information. Each chromosome is made up of DNA, a long double helix shaped molecule that contains the instructions for building proteins. Within the DNA, there are smaller sequences called genes. A gene is like a recipe that influences a particular trait, such as eye color or hair texture. Genes can come in different versions, which we call alleles. For example, there might be one allele for brown eyes and another for blue eyes. Which version you inherit will affect what trait is expressed. So genetic variation is why no two people look alike except for identical twins. It's also what allows species to adapt over time. Without genetic variation, evolution through natural selection wouldn't be possible. So think about some of the traits that are in your family, like hair color, height, or maybe even things like endedness. Which one seems to show variation, and how do you think that variation might help humans adapt over time? So let's clear some words up that often get mixed up. We have genotype and phenotype. Your genotype is your actual genetic makeup, the set of instructions written in your DNA that you inherited from your parents. Think of it as the blueprint. Your phenotype, on the other hand, is what you can actually see or measure. It's the traits that are expressed, things like hair color, height, eye color, or even build. So here's the example. Let's say someone has an allele for brown eyes and the allele for blue eyes. Their genotype would include both, but their phenotype, the part that you can actually see, would most likely be brown eyes because that allele is dominant. This distinction matters because sometimes people carry genes that don't show up in their phenotype. For instance, you might carry the gene for a recessive disorder but never develop it yourself. You could still pass it along to your children even though it's invisible in you. An allele is just a version of a gene. Some alleles are dominant, which means that if you inherit even one copy, that trait will show up in your phenotype. Other alleles are recessive, which means you need to inherit two copies, one from each parent, for the trait to be expressed. So here's an example. Imagine the allele for purple flowers is dominant and the allele for white flowers is recessive. If a plant inherits one purple and one white allele, the flowers will be purple. The dominant allele shows itself even when it's paired with the recessive one. The only way for flowers to be white is if the plant inherits two recessive alleles. When someone has two of the same allele, we call that homozygous, either two dominant alleles or two recessive alleles. When someone has two different alleles, that's called heterozygous. Punnett squares help us predict how traits might be passed from parent to child. They don't guarantee what will happen, but they can show the possible outcomes. So let's use the trait of a cleft chin as the example. The dominant allele, big B, codes for a cleft chin, and the recessive allele, little b, codes for a smooth chin. If both parents are big B, little b, their children would have a 25% chance of big B, so a cleft chin, a 50% chance of big B, little b, which is also a cleft chin because the dominant allele is shown, and a 25% chance of little b, which is a smooth chin. Overall, 3 of the 4 kids would be expected to have a cleft chin. Punnett scores are also useful in understanding genetic disorders. So take PKU, which is a recessive disorder. If both parents are carriers, there's a 25% chance of little p, and the child has PKU. A 50% chance of big N, little p, the child is a carrier but doesn't have the disorder, and a 25% chance of big N, the child has no copy of the disorder at all. Not every genetic change is inherited directly from parents, and sometimes genes can get spontaneously changed, which would be called a mutation. Mutations are permanent changes in DNA. Many mutations are harmful, some are neutral, and occasionally a mutation can even be beneficial. They're one of the ways new traits enter the gene pool, which also contributes to variation over time. Genes and environments are always interacting. Nature and nurture don't work separately, they work together to shape who we are. There are a few ways researchers talk about this interaction. We have range of reaction, which is our genes set certain limits, like the range we can fall within, and the environment helps determine where in that range we actually end up. So, for example, genes may set a potential range for intelligence, but access to nutrition, education, and opportunities affects how close someone comes to their potential. Genetic environmental correlations, this means our genes influence the kind of environments that we experience. For instance, a child with a naturally outgoing temperament might seek out more social situations, which in turn reinforces their social skills. And epigenetics, this field looks at how the same genotype can lead to different outcomes depending on the environment. It studies how experiences can turn certain genes on or off. For example, identical twins share the same DNA, but if one grows up under extreme stress while the other one does not, their health outcomes can look very different later in life. We're not simply the products of our genes, and we're not simply the product of our environment. We are shaped by the ongoing conversation between the two. So when researchers are studying behavior, they pay attention to both biology and the environment, and especially the way that the two interact. Biopsychology isn't just about genes, it's also about the cells and organs that make up the nervous system. Studying these cells gives us a closer look of how biology drives our behavior. The nervous system is made up of 2 main kinds of cells, neurons and glial cells. Glial cells, also called neuroglia, don't send messages themselves. Instead, they support and protect the neurons. They provide structure, nourishment, and even help clean up waste. Without glial cells, neurons couldn't do their job. Neurons are the basic working units of the nervous system. They're the cells that actually carry the information. Every thought, reflex, and action you've ever had depends on neurons sending electrical and chemical signals back and forth. So let's look at the structure of a neuron. We have the soma, or the body cell, that contains the nucleus, which acts as the control center. We have branch-like extensions called dendrites, and they receive incoming signals from other neurons. The axon is a long fiber that carries the signal away from the cell body. At the end of the axon are terminal buttons, which contain neurotransmitters that allow communication with the next cell. Covering parts of the axon is the myelin sheath, which is a fatty layer that helps insulate the axon and makes signals travel faster. In between one neuron's terminal button and the next neuron's dendrite is a tiny gap called the synapse, and that's where real communication happens. So if you want to picture it like this, dendrites bring information in, the soma processes it, the axon carries it down, and the terminal buttons send it out across the synapse into the next cell. A synapse is that tiny gap between one neuron's terminal button and another neuron's dendrite. Messages don't just directly jump from cell to cell. Instead, when an action potential reaches the end of the axon, neurotransmitters are released from the terminal buttons. These neurotransmitters travel across that microscopic space and bind to receptors on the next neuron's dendrites. And this is where the handoff happens. Without synapses, neurons would be isolated. They'd never be able to form the networks that make the thought, movement, and memory possible. What makes synapses so powerful is that they're not just about passing signals along, they're also points of control. A neuron might release thousands of neurotransmitter molecules, but whether the next neuron fires depends on how many receptors are activated, what type they are, and whether other signals are exciting or inhibiting the cell at the same time. And after the neurotransmitters have done their job, they don't just sit there. They either break down, drift away, or are reabsorbed back into the original cell through reuptake. This process keeps the system balanced. So even though a synapse is incredibly small, it's where signals are passed, adjusted, and controlled. So let's take a deeper look at action potential, which is the electrical signal that allows neurons to fire. Neurons exist in a fluid environment, with fluid inside the cell and fluid outside the cell. These fluids carry different charged particles called ions. Because of this, the inside of the cell is more negatively charged compared to the outside, and that difference is called the membrane potential. When the neuron is not actively sending a message, it's in a state called resting potential. It's charged up and ready to fire. When neurotransmitters from nearby neurons attach to receptors on the dendrites, they can change that membrane potential. If the potential becomes less negative, it's called depolarization, which makes the neuron more likely to fire. If the potential becomes more negative, that's called hyperpolarization, which makes the neuron less likely to fire. If the level of charge reaches what's called the threshold of excitation, the neuron becomes active and the action potential occurs. At that moment, ion channels open, sodium ions rush into the cell, and the inside briefly becomes more positive. That electrical signal then travels down the axon. Action potentials follow the all or nothing principle. That means the incoming signal is either strong enough to reach the threshold and fire, or nothing happens at all. There's no partial or weaker firing that happens. Once an action potential has occurred and neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, the signal doesn't just stay there. After the message has been delivered to the next neuron, something has to happen to those extra neurotransmitters. There's a few ways that this can happen. Some neurotransmitters simply drift away from the synapse, some are broken down by enzymes, and many are reabsorbed back into the terminal button that released them. This process is called reuptake. Reuptake is like recycling. It clears the neurotransmitters from the synapse so the signal doesn't keep firing endlessly. And it allows the original cell to use those neurotransmitters again for the next signal. This process is important because without reuptake, signals in the nervous system would overlap and blur together. Neurons wouldn't be able to rest and prepare for the next action potential. So now that we've talked about how neurons fire and how they communicate across the synapse, let's spend a little more time on the neurotransmitters themselves. These are the brain's chemical messengers. Different neurotransmitters have different jobs, and when their balance is off, it can really directly affect mood, behavior, and mental health. So here are some of the most important neurotransmitters with some examples that you may recognize from everyday life. So we have acetylcholine. This neurotransmitter is involved in muscle action, memory, and learning. Every time you move a muscle, like picking up your coffee, acetylcholine is at work. It's also tied to our memory. Low levels of acetylcholine are linked to Alzheimer's. For example, if you've ever pulled an all-nighter before an exam and then found it hard to remember what you studied, that's partially because sleep helps acetylcholine do its job in memory consolidation. Beta endorphins are the body's natural painkillers. These reduce pain and boost pleasure, often released during exercise, excitement, or even eating spicy food. So, for example, that runner's high that people often talk about after having a long workout comes from endorphins. But so does the calming, happy feeling you get after a good laugh with friends or eating your favorite comfort food. Dopamine is known for its role in reward, motivation, and movement. When you accomplish a goal, dopamine gives you that little bit of satisfaction. It's also linked to movement. Low levels are connected to Parkinson's disease as well, and too much dopamine activity, on the other hand, has been linked to schizophrenia. So, for example, here, think about the feeling you get when you hear your phone buzz with a notification. You check it, and if it's something rewarding, you get a dopamine hit. That's why social media can feel so addictive sometimes. We also have norepinephrine, which helps with alertness, arousal, and the stress response. It gears you up to respond to challenges that you may be faced with. So, for example, if you've ever been startled when someone slams a book down on the desk, that jolt you feel, your heart racing, your body suddenly becoming very alert, is norepinephrine kicking in. It also helps you stay awake and focused when you need to push through a late night study session. And lastly, we have serotonin, which is involved in mood regulation, sleep, and appetite. Low serotonin levels are linked to depression and other mood disorders. If you've ever noticed that your mood feels better after spending time in the sun, that is serotonin at work. This is why people can sometimes experience seasonal depression in winter when sunlight is more limited. Each of the neurotransmitters influences everyday life in ways that you've probably experienced, whether it's stress of exams, relief after exercise, or the motivation you feel when you're accomplishing something. And because neurotransmitters play such a huge role in behavior and mental health, one way to treat certain psychological disorders is by using psychotropic medications. These are drugs designed to restore balance in neurotransmitter systems. Psychotropic medications can work in different ways. We have agonists, which are drugs that mimic or strengthen the effects of a neurotransmitter. For example, if a disorder is linked to too little of a certain neurotransmitter, an agonist can boost its activity. Parkinson's disease is associated with low levels of dopamine, so patients are often prescribed dopamine agonists to help improve the movement. Antagonists are drugs that block or reduce the effects of a neurotransmitter. Schizophrenia, for instance, is linked to too much dopamine activity. Many antipsychotic drugs are dopamine antagonists, so they block dopamine receptors, so the signal is less intense. Now, these medications don't cure disorders, but they can help manage symptoms by adjusting the chemical balances in the brain. Low levels of serotonin are linked to depression, so one common treatment class of medication is called SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So medications like Prozac, Zoloft, or Lexapro prevent serotonin from being reabsorbed too quickly during reuptake, which keep more serotonin available in the synapse. This helps to improve mood over time. So students who are struggling with depression might find it difficult to concentrate or enjoy activities. So SSRIs can help by boosting serotonin activity, making life more manageable. With dopamine and schizophrenia, too much dopamine activity has been linked to symptoms of schizophrenia, such as hallucinations or delusions. Many antipsychotic medications are dopamine antagonists, so they block that dopamine receptor to reduce the overstimulation. This is why people treated with these drugs may notice fewer hallucinations, but sometimes also experience side effects related to movement, since dopamine affects motor control. Some anxiety medications adjust norepinephrine, calming the body stress response. So beta blockers, for example, reduce the physical symptoms of anxiety like a rapid heartbeat or trembling. Someone with test anxiety might use a beta blocker to keep their hands from shaking while giving a presentation. It's important to know that medications don't change who a person is. They adjust the chemical balance within the brain to make it easier for someone to function day to day. The nervous system is the body's main communication network. It takes in information from the outside world and from inside your body, processes it, and then coordinates a response. Without it, you wouldn't be able to move, think, or even breathe. We usually divide the nervous system up into two major parts. We have the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. The central nervous system is the command center. It receives information, processes it, and then makes decisions about what to do. The peripheral nervous system includes all of the nerves that branches out from the brain and spinal cord into the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system acts like the messenger system. It carries information to and from the central nervous system, connecting it with muscles, organs, and senses. So the central nervous system is the control hub, and the peripheral nervous system is the network of pathways that links the hub to the rest of the body. Together, they allow us to sense the world, think about it, and respond to it. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. Its job is to connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body, your muscles, organs, and senses. We can divide the peripheral nervous system into two main parts. We have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system handles voluntary actions and sensory information. It carries messages from your senses like touch, smell, or sight into the central nervous system, and it carries motor commands back out so you can move your muscles. So when you decide to raise your hand or kick a ball, the somatic system is at work. The autonomic nervous system is the part that controls the things that are happen automatically without you having to think about them. So this is things like your heartbeat, digestion, and breathing. The autonomic nervous system itself also has two branches. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for action in stressful situations. This is that fight or flight response that you hear about. Your heart races, your breathing speeds up, your senses sharpen, all to get you ready to either face the threat or run away from it. In this system of the sympathetic nervous system, you also may respond a lot with anger or anxiety. It makes sense. Fight is the anger, flight is the anxiety response. The parasympathetic nervous system does kind of the opposite. It calms the nervous system down once the threat is over. It's sometimes called rest and digest. It slows the heart rate, it conserves energy, and it helps get your body back into balance. These two systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, work like a gas pedal and a brake, keeping the body's functions balanced in a state called homeostasis. So let's look for a moment at how the nervous system is divided up because it can feel overwhelming and confusing kind of all at once. So this diagram here gives us a clear map. At the very top, we have the nervous system as a whole. From there, it splits into that central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is that brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral is everything else. Then the peripheral nervous system is broken down into the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. And then the autonomic nervous system is also divided up into sympathetic and parasympathetic. The autonomic nervous system controls the things your body does automatically, functions you don't have to consciously think about. This includes regulating your heartbeat, controlling your blood pressure, digesting food, and even adjusting your pupils in response to light. So, in other words, the autonomic nervous system keeps your body running in the background so you can focus on other things. This is divided up into two branches that kind of work like opposites, which are constantly trying to balance each other out. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the parasympathetic cannot be, and vice versa. So the sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for action and mobilization. When you're stressed, scared, excited, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and triggers the fight or flight response. Your heart rate speeds up, your breathing becomes faster, your pupils dilate, and blood is directed away from non-essential processes like digestion and toward muscles so you can either face the threat that's happening or escape it. And the parasympathetic nervous system brings the body back to normal once the stress has passed. This is sometimes called rest and digest. It slows your heart rate down, lowers your breathing, reactivates digestion so your body can conserve energy and recover. The thing to remember is that these two systems don't work in isolation, they balance each other out. Without the sympathetic system, you wouldn't be able to react quickly to danger. But without the parasympathetic system, your body would stay stuck in overdrive and eventually burn out. The brain is made up of billions of interconnected neurons and glial cells. It's bilateral, meaning it has two sides, a left side and a right side, that mirror each other. Even though we can separate the brain into distinct lobes and regions, it is important to remember that these areas are highly interactive. No part of the brain works in complete isolation. They communicate constantly to keep us thinking, feeling, moving, and responding to the world. The spinal cord is the main communication highway between the brain and the rest of the body. It delivers messages back and forth. Sensory nerves carry information in and up to the brain, and motor nerves send commands back out to the muscles and organs. The spinal cord is functionally organized into about 30 segments, with each segment connected to a specific part of the body through the peripheral nervous system. The top of the spinal cord merges with the brainstem, and the bottom ends just below the ribs. One of the most fascinating features of the spinal cord is its ability to manage reflexes. In survival situations, the spinal cord can initiate motor commands without sending the signal all the way up to the brain first. For example, when you touch something hot, your hand pulls away almost instantly. That reflex is a coordination by the spinal cord before your brain even processes what happened. Imagine if the signal had to travel all the way to your brain first. It could take several more moments for you to even register that the thing you're touching is hot, and you could end up being severely injured. That's why these reflexes and these communications to the spinal cord are so important to our survival. The brain is divided into two hemispheres. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and they are separated by a deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. Even though they look like mirror images, each hemisphere is specialized for certain functions, a concept called lateralization. The left hemisphere is generally associated with logic, language, and analytical thinking, and it controls the right side of the body, while the right hemisphere is more connected to creativity, spatial abilities, and recognizing patterns like faces or music, and it controls the left side of the body. The two sides don't work alone, though. They're connected by a thick bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum acts like a bridge and allows the hemisphere to communicate and coordinate with each other. Without it, the brain's two halves would essentially be cut off from one another. Researchers have learned about lateralization through studies of people who have had their corpus callosum severed to treat severe epilepsy. These split brain patients taught us that each hemisphere can process information independently, but most of the time they function together seamlessly. The brain can be divided into three major parts. We have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Each one plays a different role, but they all work together. The forebrain is the largest and most complex part. It's responsible for higher level functions like thinking, reasoning, emotions, memory, and voluntary movements. This is where you'll find structures like the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and limbic system. The midbrain is smaller and located beneath the forebrain. It's important for regulating sleep and alertness, motor control, and producing neurotransmitters like dopamine. We'll come back to this more in a little bit. And the hindbrain sits at the back of the skull. It keeps us alive by controlling vital functions like breathing, heart rate, and balance. The medulla, pons, and cerebellum are all part of the hindbrain. We'll also dive into those shortly. So you can think of the brain as layered. The hindbrain handles basic survival functions and is also called the reptilian brain. The midbrain helps regulate movement and alertness, and the forebrain handles the most advanced processes. Now that we've introduced these, let's dive a little bit more into forebrain. So the forebrain is the largest and most advanced part of the brain. It's where we see the highest mental functions. So thinking, planning, language, emotion, memory. We have the cerebral cortex as part of this piece of the brain. This is the wrinkled outer layer of the brain. It's involved in our highest mental processes: thought, consciousness, reasoning, language, and memory. The thalamus acts as the brain's relay station. Almost all sensory information, except for smell, passes through the thalamus before being directed to other parts of the brain for processing. The hypothalamus helps to regulate our basic survival functions like body temperature, appetite, and blood pressure. It also links the nervous system to the endocrine system by controlling the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland because it regulates the activity of the other glands in the body. It controls growth, metabolism, and hormone release. And our limbic system is known as the brain's emotion and memory circuit. It includes the amygdala, which helps us process emotions like fear, and the hippocampus, which is essential for forming new memories and learning. All of these structures work together to help keep the body in balance and connect our biology to our behavior. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the forebrain. It's highly folded which increases its surface area and allows for more complex processing. The cortex is where our higher mental abilities take place, that conscious thought, reasoning, logic, language, memory, and emotion. We divide the cortex into four lobes, each with its own main functions. But again, these don't work in isolation, they're constantly communicating with each other. So we have the frontal lobe, which is involved in planning, organization, judgment, reasoning, attention, and emotional regulation. It also houses important areas like the motor cortex, which controls voluntary movement, the prefrontal cortex, which handles higher level thinking, decision making, impulse control, and Broca's area, which is located in the left hemisphere, which is critical for speech production. So, remembering Phineas Gage from a previous lecture, while he was working on the railroad, an accident sent an iron rod through his skull and that frontal lobe. Gage survived, but his personality changed drastically after that. Before the accident, he was responsible and mild-mannered. Afterwards, became very impulsive and erratic. This case gave early evidence that the frontal lobe plays a key role in personality and impulse control. Next, we have the parietal lobe, which processes sensory and perceptual information. Now, this is responsible for the somatosensory cortex, which is essential for processing touch, temperature, and pain. This part of the brain is organized topographically, meaning specific areas of the cortex respond to sensations from specific parts of the body. The temporal lobe is associated with hearing, memory, emotion, and language. It contains the auditory cortex, which processes sound, and Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere, which is critical for language comprehension. Damage to Wernicke's area results in difficulty understanding language, and Broca's and Wernicke's areas affect language in different ways. So Broca's area is the production of speech, so you know what you want to say, but you can't form the words. And Wernicke's area is the comprehension of speech, which means you can speak fluently, but the words may not make any sense. The last lobe here is the occipital lobe, and that is devoted to vision. So it contains the primary visual cortex, which interprets incoming visual information. The occipital lobe is organized retinotopically, meaning different parts of the visual field map onto specific areas of the cortex. Together, these four lobes work as an integrated system and allow us to sense the world, respond to it, and communicate with others. The thalamus acts as the brain's relay center. Almost all sensory information, vision, hearing, touch, and taste, passes through the thalamus before being sent to other areas of the brain for processing. One exception is smell, which has a more direct pathway. You can think of the thalamus like a central switchboard operator. It doesn't just pass signals along, it helps direct the sensory information to the right place so the brain can make sense of it. For example, when you touch something hot, the sensory information goes to the thalamus, and from there it's relayed to the part of the cortex that processes touch. The thalamus makes sure the information gets where it needs to go quickly and accurately. The limbic system is the brain's emotion and memory circuit. It's made up of several structures that work together to regulate emotions, form memories, and maintain important survival functions. So we have the amygdala, and this is the feeling center of our brain. It's the structure that's involved in processing our emotions, especially fear and aggression, and it ties emotional meaning to our memories and helps us respond quickly to threats. I tell clients regularly that our amygdala, when it's activated, is like a tantruming toddler. It wants what it wants when it wants it, and it does not care about the consequences. Our hippocampus is essential for learning and memory. It helps us form new memories and connects emotions to those memories. And the hypothalamus helps to regulate our homeostasis and the body's balance. It helps keep things like temperature, hunger, blood pressure in check, and it also influences our motivation and drive. As an example here, imagine you were in a car accident. The amygdala would be active in processing the fear and the shock in the moment. The hippocampus would help to encode the memory of what's happening and what had happened. And the hypothalamus would regulate your body stress response, so the racing heart, sweating, increased blood pressure. Later on, when you think about driving past that same intersection, your limbic system might trigger some of those same emotional and physical responses. The midbrain sits just below the forebrain, and it plays a really important role in regulating sleep and alertness, movement, producing certain neurotransmitters, and it acts like a hub that helps to coordinate information that flows between the forebrain and the hindbrain. Some of its key structures are the reticular formation. This network of neurons helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle, alertness, and motor activity. It's what keeps you awake and attentive during the day, and also what helps control muscle reflexes tied to posture and movement. The substantia nigra is an area that produces dopamine and is critical for controlling movement. When the substantia nigra degenerates, it can lead to Parkinson's disease, which causes tremors and difficulties with movement. The ventral tegmental area also produces dopamine and is strongly linked with mood, reward, and addiction. The VTA is a part of the brain's reward system. It's what lights up when you experience pleasure, like eating your favorite food or hearing a song you really love. So together, these midbrain structures connect motivation, movement, and alertness, and they remind us that even small regions in the brain can have a powerful effect on our daily lives. The hindbrain sits at the back of the skull and connects directly to the spinal cord. The hindbrain is sometimes grouped together with the midbrain and the brainstem because these regions handle many of the body's basic life-sustaining functions. The medulla controls automatic processes like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. These are the functions that you don't consciously think about, but you can't survive without. Damage to the medulla is often fatal because it regulates such vital processes. The pons acts as a bridge connecting the brain and the spinal cord. It also helps to regulate brain activity during sleep. The word pons actually means bridge in Latin. The cerebellum plays a big role in balance, coordination, and movement. It helps us fine-tune our motor skills like riding a bike, playing a piano, or even walking steadily. The cerebellum is also thought to be involved in certain types of memory, especially those tied to motor learning. These areas work together to keep the body alive and functioning smoothly. This next piece is not included in your textbook, but I wanted to show you a simple way of remembering the major parts of the brain using your hand. And this is called the hand model of the brain. There is a link here on this slide that you can click on. It'll bring you to a YouTube video for a visual aid here. So you can start by holding up your hand, palm facing you. The palm and your wrist represent the brainstem. This is the part of the brain that controls your survival function, so your heartbeat, breathing, and other automatic processes that keep you alive. So now tuck your thumb into your palm, and this represents the limbic system, the amygdala and the hippocampus. This is your emotional brain here, the part that processes fear, anger, joy, and also helps form your memories. Now fold your fingers down and over your thumb. Your fingers represent the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. The very front, which is your fingertips, represents the prefrontal cortex, which is where the planning, reasoning, impulse control, and decision-making happens. So when your hand is closed, you can see how the cortex folds over the limbic system, which sits right on top of the brain cell. And that's exactly how your real brain is layered. Survival at the base, emotions in the middle, and higher level thinking on the top. Sometimes people describe being upset or overwhelmed as flipping your lid. So in this model, if you were to open your fingers upwards, it's like the cortex is no longer covering the limbic system. And that's what it feels like when emotions take over and it's really hard to think clearly. Can you think of a time when you were so emotional that it felt like really difficult to make a rational decision. That's what it's like flipping your lid open, your limbic system taking over without your cortex keeping it in check. The hand model can give us an easy way to remember that the brain works in layers: the brainstem for survival, the limbic system for emotion and memory, and the cortex for higher thinking. So, how do researchers and scientists and psychologists actually study the brain? Well, they can't exactly open it up while it's working, so we have a lot of brain imaging techniques that we can use to see structure and activity. So we have CT scans. So this uses x-rays to create detailed images of the brain structure. It's often used to detect things like tumors, injuries, or brain bleeds. We have PET scans, which involve injecting a small amount of radioactive substance, contrast, into the bloodstream. It shows activity in the brain by highlighting areas where blood flow and energy are used higher. PET scans are often used in research to study processes like emotion or memory. Then we have MRIs and fMRIs. So MRIs are things that use strong magnetic fields and radio waves to produce very detailed images of the brain structure. It doesn't use radiation, and it's especially good for looking at soft tissues. Now, an fMRI is a functional MRI, and it goes a step further by measuring changes in blood flow over time. This allows researchers to see what areas of the brain are active during specific tasks, like solving a problem or looking at an image. And we have EEGs, which measure electrical activity in the brain using electrodes placed on the scalp. It doesn't give a clear picture of structures, but it's excellent for tracking brainwave activity, such as during sleep studies or when diagnosing seizures. Each of these tools gives us a different window into the brain. Some show structures like CTs and MRIs, while others show functions like PET scans, fMRIs, or EEGs. While the nervous system communicates using electrical and chemical signals through neurons, the endocrine system communicates using hormones, chemical messengers that travel through the bloodstream. Because they use the blood, hormones act more slowly than neurotransmitters, but their effects can also last much, much longer. The endocrine system works closely with the nervous system to regulate processes like growth, metabolism, stress responses, and reproduction. It plays a huge role in maintaining the balance in our body that we call homeostasis. So we have our pituitary glands, which are our master glands because it regulates the other glands in the system. It controls growth, hormone release, and connects closely with the hypothalamus. Our thyroid gland regulates metabolism, energy, and growth. Problems with thyroid hormones can lead to issues like weight changes, fatigue, or mood problems. So in therapy, well, one of the things they taught us in grad school was when someone comes in with anxiety or depression, we should highly recommend that they get their thyroid checked to make sure that it's not a thyroid issue causing the changes in their mood. Adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys and release hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which are involved in our stress responses. The pancreas produces insulin and regulates our blood sugar levels. Imbalances here can be connected to diabetes. Then we have our gonads, which are things like ovaries and testes, which produce our sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, which influences our reproduction and also can impact our behavior and our mood. A good example of how the nervous system and endocrine systems work together is the fight or flight response. When you're stressed, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, but so do the adrenal glands, releasing adrenaline, cortisol, and a bunch of other hormones into the system. And this combination prepares your body to respond to the challenges. So that brings us to the end of our endocrine system. We've seen how hormones, along with neurotransmitters, help regulate the body and connect biology to our behavior. And the genetics, nervous system, and the brain and the endocrine system, you can see the full picture of how biology shapes what we do. So this is going to wrap up chapter 3. We've talked about genetics, the nervous system, the brain, and the endocrine system, and how they all work together to shape our behavior.